Hello, everybody. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about translation and interpretation and the difference between the two of them and what each one of these consists of. So, interpreting refers to the oral translation of a spoken message or text. So, in this case, it's when somebody is communicating orally in a different language. For example, if I was to take the spoken language English and interpret it into the spoken language of Spanish. And the term interpretation is often used interchangeably with interpreting, but some professionals believe or warn that these should be avoided in this context. When speaking about the difference between interpreting and interpretation, it's important to know to make the distinction between these two words, especially in the case of court interpreting, where interpretation is in the sense of conveying one's understanding of meanings and intention, and this is actually an activity in which interpreters are actually supposed to avoid. The history of interpreting isn't actually well documented, and although it is generally agreed that as an activity it is older than written translation, so from the records that we do have, it seems as though that interpreting, so the oral change of language, is possibly older than the actual written translation of languages. So what are the differences between interpreting and translation? The communication skills which it requires are clearly different, as interpreters need to be experts in oral communication or speaking, and translators often have more opportunities and have more time to make revisions and edits and to a final draft than, say, an interpreter would, because an interpreter is having to speak in the moment. And interpreters must also ensure that any background knowledge in which they are likely to need has been acquired in advance. So somebody who has no experience in, say, the legal field and doesn't quite know the terminology or how the legal system is kind of set up, they would not be able to, or they would be able to do it, but would have a much harder time because they don't have that background knowledge of the topic or subject at hand. And interpreters can be thought of as performers who constantly are making split-second decisions and taking risks in their communication. And consequently, they typically experience higher stress levels while on the job than their translator counterparts. And the types of interpreting are um, are pretty different. There's either by the context in which it occurs, for example, community interpreting or conference interpreting, or even court interpreting, or the way in which it is carried out. In other words, such as consecutive interpreting, liaison interpreting, simultaneous interpreting, or whispered interpreting. There's, even though there's an extensive amount of overlap in between both, say, community interpreting and simultaneous interpreting, these categories have different ways in which the actual language that is used, and also there's a completely different set of approaches for when it comes to sign language interpreting, since these are all, or since sign language interpreting is considered, or isn't considered, it is a more visual language. And these are the types of interpreting in terms of context of use. So it's community interpreting, conference interpreting, and then court interpreting. So community, or the dialogue interpreting or public service interpreting, takes place in the public service sector and helps facilitate the communication between officials and others. And its purpose is to provide access to a public service, such as a presidential debate or any other political function. And it normally occurs in a one-on-one setting and tends to be kind of two-directional. And it's most likely going to be performed consecutively. In conference interpreting, a term used to refer to the type of interpreting which occurs in international conferences, as well as high-profile settings. And the role of conference interpreters is one of mediating between a knowledge speaker and his or her audience. So, for example, would be a political speech. So obviously the politician is going to have more of that knowledge, and the interpreter's kind of role in this would be to help assist in conveying the ideas and topics of the professional. And conference interpreters need to be proficient in all of the interpreting techniques, which we'll get into later on. And court interpreters. This is when we're talking about any kind of legal interpreting, but more than likely it's going to take place in a courtroom or somewhere in a more than likely in a courthouse, and it has to come to occupy a higher position than other types of legal interpreting. What distinguishes court interpreting from other types of interpreting is its close attention to ethical issues which arise from the function of the courtroom. And as one could imagine, the issues that can arise from misinterpreting a, say, attorney's phrase or misinterpreting a judge's instructions. And the interpreting strategies that are used the most, especially in reference to court interpreting, is the fidelity, impartiality, and also confidentiality because of the situations you are in. And it looks like that's going to be the end of today's episode. And thank you so much for watching.